Welcome to this week's edition of Not Your Average Globetrotter, where we are taking care of business and working overtime. Roll that intro. Hello there, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Welcome back. And this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the important factors to take into consideration when doing business in Europe. I know there are a lot of you who watch these videos who are digital nomads or entrepreneurs, or maybe somewhere in between the two of those, and are interested in working with people from Europe. And that's one thing, is that no matter where you go on earth, people are going to have their way of doing things, which may differ from your own. That's a given, but I wanted to specifically talk about some things to consider when doing business here in Europe. Of course, as I always have to say, I'm going to be doing a lot of generalizing here, but also definitely take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, because most of my exposure is working with the Southern European markets, as well as I do have some exposure to the central, it's like German and other Central European markets, and a little bit Scandinavian, as well as with a little bit of the British market. So just take that into account when I'm talking about my opinions here in this episode. It's based on what I've been through. And the first thing is that when you are working in Europe, is that it's not just working with one market. Yes, there's a single currency that is shared between most of Europe, not all, but that's kind of where a lot of things end, because even the amount of money that people will earn and working with individuals from the north, south, east, west can vary greatly. But some of these things could be larger, some smaller. But one of the kind of most basic things to consider is punctuality. This topic could be a can of worms and will vary greatly depending on what part of Europe that you're in. I mean, if you're in a place like Germany, of course, in a lot of Central Europe also, you're going to need to be on time. You're going to have to be like pretty darn punctual, but as well as Northern Europe. But when you're talking about Southern Europe, we'll just say it's a mixed bag. We'll put it that way. But one thing that I've noticed can be a little bit of a surprise, as well as something that it might be a little bit tricky to adjust to for many North Americans, is how social business interactions can be here when doing business. That doesn't matter if you're at a business meeting or if you're doing business at a shop, whatever it may be, you're going to find some situations where there's going to be a little bit more involved before you actually get down to the nitty-gritty. What I'm talking about is actually having a genuine connection with the person that you may be sitting across the table from. I'm not going to say this is going to be in every case, in every situation, but very much, again, generalizing, there will be situations where somebody may end up getting into some personal aspects of your life that you might not be used to getting into. Even though things will get a little bit personal at times for maybe what might be considered to be from an American perspective or a North American perspective, it still doesn't go beyond a certain level. So that's one thing to consider. So you may have somebody ask you about your spouse, your parents, your children, but you're not going to necessarily have to go into detail about what's going on, or this, or, oh, your wife is this, or your husband is that, or this, or whatever. It's going to be kind of just like a little check-in, almost kind of like you make sure that the other person knows that you care about them to an extent, even if it's not necessarily your actual friend. And the longer that your working relationship goes on, the more that may be expected as a norm. But of course, this could depend on what part of Europe you're in. In a lot of Southern Europe, I've noticed this almost sometimes seems to be an unconscious expectation that this comes at the beginning of your meeting, that you ease your way into it, that you don't necessarily hop in and get straight to work. I've actually spoken to people who've said that for them, it's a bit jolting and it's a bit strange when Americans just want to hop straight into work, because it's almost like allowing things to kind of warm up and relax a little first. And I'm not saying that I haven't had interactions where we've just jumped straight into business, because this will depend on the situation, where if the person or you are like in a rush and you need to get through it, then that could affect what you're doing. Like if the person has a big business and they're running everything, then they might not have the headspace to deal with everything that you have to talk about in that meeting. So in that case, then maybe you have to rush through. But at the same time, I can say I've had a lot of meetings in Europe, in Southern Europe particularly, that run way beyond what they're scheduled for. But in Northern European situations, Central European situations, I've noticed more that there's a little bit more of a rigidity in like kind of, all right, if we're having a meeting, this is what we're discussing, and this is when we're discussing this, for how long we're discussing. There's a bit more structure to it. And also just an example of what this socialization can look like. Not that it always would look like this. What will be very often is, for example, if you're going to someone's office or they're coming to your office or your home, whatever it may be, coffee. It's an absolute necessity. Like, you have to be able to offer the person coffee, or they have to be able to offer you coffee. Like, if that is not part of it, then it's like, from what I've noticed as an outsider coming in, it almost seems as though it's a faux pas not to make that offer. Not necessarily that you're going to have to accept it, and not that everybody will accept, but it's just as long as it's kind of an option there. And then even when you're in Italy, sometimes you'll see not only coffee, but orzo. I'm not sure what it is in English, but it's a coffee alternative. But I also have been in situations in Italy where I was offered coffee, and when I said, no, sorry, I don't drink coffee, they got a little bit horrified. There was a point when I did drink coffee, and it was like, okay, it was normal. But as soon as I stopped drinking coffee, then I was like, what is this person? What is this alien creature in our office? Can we trust this thing? But I've noticed this time and time again that it's very common to have that check-in, that socialization, to work your way into the meeting. And just to go off on a little bit of a tangent, I've mentioned this in the past, but if you are in social situations, just generally speaking in Europe, you can find, at least in Southern Europe, maybe other parts of Europe it might be a little bit different, but it's almost seen as rude if you're in a social interaction, like say at a restaurant or any type of non-work social situation, where if you ask somebody what they do, it's almost like asking, how much money do you make? Or for some people, they don't like that question. It's, again, a faux pas to kind of ask that right away. I mean, eventually you can kind of work your way into it, especially when you're friendly with someone. And there will be situations that people will ask you early on, but it's going to be a mixed bag for sure. But I've spoken to a lot of people that have the opinion, something along the lines of them not being happy with that question, because it's almost as though you're reducing that person to what they do and not who they are. And just my personal take on it is that it might have slightly to do a little bit with kind of a little bit of a work-life balance mentality, especially in Southern Europe, where your work time is your work time. Any time that's not at work is sacred. I mean, even France, and I think France is actually not the only country that has this, where there are actually laws against being contacted by your employer outside of work hours. Like, it's taken quite seriously. And it's not just Southern Europe, but you find a lot in Southern Europe that the work time is the work time and any time else is that person's time. So, for example, even if you're making contact with a business, the worst times to expect a response, especially like email or even sometimes to make a phone call, would be like, say, in the afternoon during lunch or after a certain hour or late evening. Like, I'm not going to say that it never would happen that you'll get an email late at night, but it's not as common. I've noticed that a lot of people do have boundaries when it comes to this, and I don't blame them. I think it's somewhat healthy, actually, to have that. Not just somewhat, pretty darn healthy. And of course, weekends are a question. Sundays, forget it. And holidays, no way. But of course, this is generalizing. You will find people who do work on those times as well. But to go in a very different direction when doing business in Europe is that you have to consider about that, even though it, again, is this one single market currency area, that the pricing of services and goods will vary greatly depending on where you are. For a lot of like kind of international major goods, like for, I don't know, electronics or clothing or whatever it may be, computer gear, those will have pretty similar prices across the board. But especially when it comes to services and certain like materials, those prices could vary greatly depending on where you are. So one thing that you'll have to take in mind when working with different clients across the European Union is that you will have to make sure when you are quoting, if you are in the type of business where you don't have set prices and you're having to come up with specific quotes for each different project that you're working on, then you may have to consider where you're sending that quote to and who you're sending that quote to, because it's very easy to be able to overquote or underquote, each one coming with their own separate issues. But along a similar line of thought, when you're talking about payments and so on and doing business itself, haggling and negotiating are not necessarily going to be as much of a thing in this part of the world as maybe they might be in others. In Southern Europe, okay, you're going to have some wiggle room within what you can do, but if you're working, again, Germans, Central Europeans, Northern Europeans, negotiation, even if you try to budge a little bit, it's going to be very off-putting. And I've actually sat at negotiation tables where I've seen an American come in, try to haggle through something, and the other person being extremely offended by that because that's not what they do. The price is the price, and that's what it is. In Southern Europe, though, it can differ. there can be some flexibility sometimes, but you're going to have to kind of play it by ear and feel out the situation. Of course, there are going to be situations where, like, if you're just going to a store and buying something kind of regular as a consumer, then you're not going to really have that same ability there. I mean, maybe if you're going to a big box electronics store, you can say, hey, are there any sales or anything going on? But beyond that, I would say to be very, very careful. But on a similar line of thought, when it comes to payments themselves, something that might be a little bit different than what might be normal in the US is that in Europe, bank transfers, especially between businesses and especially for large sums, are very common, extremely common. It's not like you're not going to be able to pay by like a credit card, but to pay by a wire transfer is very common. So if you are in the US and you're wanting to do business with Europeans, actually setting your business up with some type of Wise account, like formerly known as TransferWise, they have these kind of like bank account type things that you can open on their website, and you can hold different currencies in that account. And one of the different currencies, of course, is the euro. And that euro account will also come with an IBAN number, basically to simplify it, your banking number for Europe. And when you're working with European clients, that actually is going to help you in a lot of situations where making transfers within the European Union is going to be a lot easier. And especially when making it in their own currency, you're going to be adding a lot of convenience for your clients. So if you are working in dollars and euros or multiple currencies, to allow your European clients to be able to pay in euros is going to make life easier for them, because when you're trying to send money outside of the European Union, also the transfer rates can get a little bit higher. But there are going to be banks in Europe where you can actually have included in your account unlimited transfers per month, or up to X amount of transfers per month without having to pay for them, or you pay a specific fee. It's just going to depend on your bank. Or if you need a regular wire transfer, then the transfer would be free. But if you need an instant transfer, then the transfer might cost couple euros, of €1.50, €2, €3. I've heard of 5 in the past, but I don't think that's so common these days. I don't know of a bank off the top of my head that would take €5 for a transfer fee. If you find that, look for another bank, I would say. But even when you're making payments online, there are many websites that will accept a bank transfer. And it's not necessarily unusual. It's a little bit more complicated, and it takes longer for the payment to go through because you have to have that processing time. So it's much more normal to pay by card in that situation, but it's not like it's unheard of. But in Portugal specifically, you have the Multibanco system and MBWay, where you can, it's basically the Portuguese interbank and transfer system and interpersonal and business transfer system that's domestic to here. It's kind of like an additional system on top of the wire transfer system that you can find across Europe. And I've actually had the experience here in Portugal where even if you don't hit instant transfer, that the money will show up in the other person's account instantly. So that's really convenient. Not necessarily when you're doing from one country to another, or even in Italy, I had the experience where maybe it would take a couple days to get to another bank outside of my own bank. But another thing that you actually really don't see here are checks. I mean, it's not like they don't exist, but it's not even, in my opinion, really worthwhile, especially here in Portugal, at least at my bank. I don't know about other banks, but I would assume it might be somewhat similar. I'm not going to say they're a scam, but maybe borderline. In Portugal, there's a thing where you can't take out more than €250 in cash from a bank. And I was looking into, are there alternative ways that are legal, of course, to get your money out of the bank without having to have this limit or having to visit multiple different ATMs and doing the rounds to get your money out. And I spoke to a banker, and they said, oh, well, what you can do is you can get checks, and it's actually going to be a bit cheaper. You're not going to have to pay a teller's fee when you go up to the teller, or you can take out X amount or put in money. And I was like, okay, I'll get some checks because that's going to make things easier for me. And it was, I want to say something like for 5 or 6 checks, maybe €12. But the kicker was that they have an expiration date, I want to say for like a year or two after the date that I ordered them. So it's like, I don't expect that I'm going to use that many checks in the next X amount of time until they expire. So as soon as I got that and I saw that, because nobody told me that they're going to have an expiration date, I've never heard of a check expiring before. So that's another thing to consider if you are actually going to base your business here in Europe. But that takes me to my next point, that if you are going to base your business in Europe, this kind of leads back to an earlier point as well, kind of regarding pricing. It's connected to that, where if you are going to be based in Europe, you need to make sure that you understand the system and how it works, and that you understand how you're registered. Because from what I've seen, there seem to be usually two different types of systems, and within each one, it's kind of an umbrella, and it breaks out into different tax schemes. But generally speaking, there'll be tax schemes where you don't have to collect sales tax, otherwise known as EVA or VAT, value added tax. And then there are going to be other types of business structures where you will have to collect that money. However, it's also going to depend on your clients. And so if you're working with just private individuals domestically, then you're going to have to charge tax. But if you're working with private individuals in the European Union, and this is if you are registered here, of course, this is not advice. This is just a general kind of idea of how things can work. Because whatever situation you're in, you're going to have to follow the advice of your accountant. But what could be, again, is that if you are registered in your country to collect tax and you're working with another EU company that is also registered and has to collect tax, then there are going to be treaties involved that will actually cancel that out, that you won't have to charge that VAT on top. And that's also another thing, is that a lot of prices that you see when you're just walking around are going to be the price including tax. So what you see is basically what you pay. But when you're online or making professional purchases, there will be times when you sometimes see price not including, or there will be some websites where you will see that you can turn on and off the option for the tax to be automatically calculated there. Or if you're purchasing from Amazon, for example, it's actually a whole different website that you have to go to if you're running it as a business, where you will be able to see the prices without the value added tax there. And it's a completely different system that you actually have to apply for. So like I was saying, this can relate to your quotes by understanding what your situation is for your client. So this is how it relates to what I was talking about before with the pricing, is that if you know your client is not obliged to collect tax themselves, then you want to make sure that your price is not going to jump up an extra 23% and make it out of their reach. Or that if you are quoting a price, that it is within that and you're not going to be losing out. Of course, if you have expenses associated with it, then that's a whole different thing. And I'm not going to get into business and legal advice and financial advice here. But this is one thing that you'll have to keep in mind if you are deciding to register here. And I personally am of the opinion that it's actually worthwhile in many cases. But of course, you will need to speak to an accountant on your own to see if it is worthwhile for your particular situation. It can be, it might not be for some people, depending on what type of work they're doing, and also if they have a lot of expenses throughout the year. So there are going to be various factors that come into this. Going back a little bit more to the cultural aspect of things, is that even though there is almost an expected social aspect of the business interaction, there is also a little bit more of formality in a way. And like I said earlier, that you may be talking about like, how's your wife? How's your husband? How's your mother? How's your father? Or how are your kids? And not go past a certain point. It's kind of like, all right, we've gotten this far, and this is where it is of comfort to everybody that we are all kind of at the same level. We don't need to go beyond this. But of course, shaking hands, looking in someone's eyes directly, or using sir or madam or my colleague, instead of saying coworker. People don't use that as much out here. But I think that's also a direct translation from some languages. But even if you go to like a shop where someone might say, like, if you're trying to buy a pair of jeans or something, instead of saying, oh, I have to check in the back, or I have to check with my coworker, I'll have to check with my colleague. It's like the first time I ever heard that. It's like, I'm buying jeans, not a Lamborghini. I don't need the white glove treatment for my jeans. So you will, of course, also notice a little bit of emotional separation as well, that you will have the social aspect of your business interaction, which can separate from the business part of your interaction. So even though you're not hopping directly into the business interaction, that there will be kind of that separation, so to speak, between church and state. So if you are used to startups, or you're coming from Silicon Valley and you're used to working in kind of a more laid back situation, then you may have to change gears a little bit, maybe not speak as openly or as freely with your coworkers or with your clients or your customers, whatever the name is for whoever it is that you're working with. You may want to kind of gauge it on a person by person basis. And again, generalizing based on what I've noticed is that even with startups in Europe, is that there's a little bit more of a formality to them, and they're not as kind of easygoing as some startups can be that I've worked with from the US, for example. And so the formality is not just about your personal interaction, but also about the way that you dress and the way that you carry yourself. And maybe wearing jeans in some situations might not be appropriate, but you will notice in some situations, and it's, I think, becoming more and more accepted, especially kind of in Southern Europe, especially for guys, like to wear a button-up shirt and jeans, and then maybe some type of sports coat over that. Just like a nice kind of modern, fresh look. But there will be still people who will wear suits to places that they don't need to. I mean, not that it's going to be everywhere. I mean, I think it's becoming less and less common, but it's not unheard of. But then even kind of jumping back to what I was mentioning about startups before, is that the way that sometimes they can be defined out here, I've seen them defined a couple of different ways. I mean, I once interacted with a startup, quote unquote, that was 60 years old. Didn't make sense to me. It was a well-established company, and I've not heard of just that one instance. That was just the only one that I've personally had interactions with. But the definition can also lend itself more towards what people will usually think of as a startup, as a younger company as well. So that might be another thing to quickly take into account, is the terminology that you're using. Like I said, even before colleague, that's not uncommon to hear. Some of the terminology that you may use and hear might be used in a similar way or could differ slightly than what you're used to, generally speaking. So when you are doing business in Europe, just to wrap things up, I would say, of course, approach a person, as I've said in many episodes. At the end of the day, we're all human and we only want to get treated that way. So the more of a personal connection that you can make with someone, I think is really going to help the interaction at the end of the day, regardless. But taking into account cultural norms and sensitivities will also go a long way, and to kind of have an idea of how people go about things will definitely benefit you. But this is where I'm going to round out this episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. So thank you all so much for joining me again. Of course, the biggest thank you to those of you who help to make these episodes possible on a month-to-month basis through rafaeldifuria.com/Patreon, patreon.com/rafaeldifuria, and the one-time donations, especially through here on YouTube, through the thanks button. That really does help this project to be able to continue. And of course, a huge thank you to those of you who take part in the conversation and join in the conversation in the comment section below here on YouTube, as well as sharing these videos with your friends and clicking the like button and being subscribed with the notification bell. All of it does greatly help out the channel. Of course, as always, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Later.